Luigi Mangione, an alleged killer and subject of public fascination after days on the run, charged with the New York City murder of a healthcare insurance CEO, an industry so maligned that many Americans are celebrating the shooter as a hero.
It is very concerning because we are talking about a very cold-blooded murder.
How did it all come to this for the 26-year-old born into a life of privilege and potential?
I can tell you that this is one of the last people you'd think would do something like this. He was one of the nicest kids.
It's unimaginable. I was roommates with him, unfathomable, knowing the kind, person that I saw and knew.
A sign of how much has changed, this was Mangione back in 2016, valedictorian of his class at a prestigious private school in Baltimore.
As we embrace the new, however, we won't forget the old.
Former classmates say Mangione was at the top of his class and popular.
It happened in the kind of place where people feel untouchable. A quiet Manhattan morning. Expensive hotels, suited executives, early meetings, and the steady rhythm of a city already awake before sunrise. At exactly 6:45 a.m., a man stepped out onto the street, just another powerful figure walking into another important day. He never made it, because somewhere nearby, someone had already been waiting, not for minutes, not for hours, but for days, watching, tracking, studying every movement, every routine, every possible escape. And when the moment finally came, it was over in seconds. No warning, no argument, no hesitation, just footsteps from behind, and the sharp, controlled silence of a weapon designed not to be heard. By the time anyone realized what had happened, the shooter was already gone, disappearing into one of the busiest cities in the world as if he had never been there at all. But this wasn't random. It wasn't a robbery. And it wasn't personal in the way most murders are. According to investigators, this was something far more chilling, a calculated execution, a message, a man who allegedly spent months planning not just a killing, but a statement. And the target? Not just any victim, but the CEO of one of the most powerful healthcare companies in America. The question is not just who pulled the trigger, but why someone would plan something this precise, this public, and this deliberate just to be seen. Because 5 days later, hundreds of miles away, sitting quietly inside a fast food restaurant, the man police believe is responsible was finally spotted, recognized, and surrounded. And what they found on him would only deepen the mystery and confirm one terrifying truth. This wasn't a crime of impulse. It was something far more dangerous. Something that raises a question we're still trying to answer. What happens when someone decides that murder is the only way to make the world listen? If you think you understand this case, wait until you see how far it really goes. The moment the officers stepped inside that fast food restaurant in Altoona, everything changed. It didn't look like the ending of a manhunt. There were no sirens screaming, no dramatic chase, no resistance, just a quiet room, the low hum of conversation, and one man sitting alone. To anyone else, he looked ordinary. But to the worker behind the counter who had been staring just a little too long, something didn't feel right. The face remembered, a detail that matched, a feeling that wouldn't go away. And that single moment of recognition, one person choosing to speak up, would bring an entire operation crashing down. When the officers approached him, they didn't rush. They didn't need to, because by then, they already believed they had found the man who had vanished into New York City just days earlier. They asked questions, simple ones, but the answers didn't sit right. He gave them identification, but it wasn't real. The same false identity that had been used in New York. The same identity tied to a man who had checked into a hostel more than a week before a murder that would shake the country. And that's when everything began to unravel. Because when they searched him, what they found wasn't just suspicious. It was damning. A 9mm pistol, a suppressor, items that investigators would later say were consistent with the weapon used in the killing. Right there, in a quiet fast food restaurant miles away from the crime scene, sat a man who, according to authorities, had carried out one of the most calculated public assassinations in recent memory. But to understand how it got to that point, you have to go back to New York City, back to a date that didn't seem important at the time, November 24th. That's when, according to investigators, Luigi Mangione arrived in the city. No headlines, no attention, no one watching him, just another traveler entering Manhattan, blending into millions of others. But what made him different was that he already had a plan that had reportedly been forming for months. And the moment he stepped into the city, that plan quietly went into motion. He didn't check into a luxury hotel. He didn't draw attention. Instead, he used a false identity to rent a bed in a hostel on the Upper West Side. Cheap, temporary, anonymous. The kind of place where no one asks questions. The kind of place where people come and go without being remembered. And that's exactly what he needed. Because over the next several days, he wouldn't be resting. He would be watching. Investigators later described it as reconnaissance. Careful, deliberate surveillance. Not random movement. Not wandering. But targeted observation. He focused on two specific locations. The hotel where Brian Thompson was staying, and the venue where Thompson was scheduled to speak at an investor conference. Two places tied to a man who, at that moment, had no idea someone was studying his every move, every entry point, every exit, every routine. Imagine that for a second. You wake up, you go about your day, you attend meetings, answer calls, walk the same streets you've walked before, and somewhere, someone is watching, learning, waiting. That's what makes this case so disturbing. Because this wasn't chaos. It was control. Prosecutors allege that Mangione tracked Thompson's movements with precision. That he didn't act until he knew exactly when and where the opportunity would present itself. And when that opportunity came, he was ready. The morning of December 4th didn't begin like anything unusual. The city was alive as it always is. People rushing to work. Taxis weaving through traffic. The quiet chill of early morning air wrapping around the streets. At around 6:45 a.m., Brian Thompson stepped out into that world. A routine moment. One he had likely lived hundreds of times before. But this time, something was different. Because not far away, a man on a bicycle was already in position. According to investigators, Mangione had left the Upper West Side earlier that morning, riding toward Midtown. Not rushing, not panicking, just moving with purpose. He arrived near West 54th Street and 6th Avenue, and then he waited, positioning himself carefully, strategically, between two parked cars, hidden just enough, close enough, because he knew exactly what was about to happen next. Moments later, the target appeared, walking, unaware, unprotected, and in those final seconds, everything that had been planned for months came down to a single decision. Mangione stepped forward, closed the distance, and from behind, he fired. Multiple shots, precise, controlled, the kind of attack designed not just to kill, but to leave no room for survival. Witnesses would later describe confusion, panic, disbelief. Because in a place like Manhattan, violence like this deliberate, this targeted, is rare. And before anyone could fully process what they were seeing, it was over. Brian Thompson was down, and the shooter was already leaving. No hesitation, no second look, just a clean exit, back onto the bicycle, moving north, cutting through Central Park, using the city itself as cover. And within moments, he was gone, vanished into one of the most densely populated places on Earth. That's what made this case explode. Not just the murder, but how it was carried out, the precision, the planning, the escape. It forced investigators to ask a chilling question. Who does something like this? And more importantly, why? Because as law enforcement began to piece together what had happened, a disturbing narrative started to emerge. This wasn't about money. It wasn't about revenge in the traditional sense. According to federal authorities, this was something else entirely. They believe Mangione wasn't just trying to kill a man. He was trying to send a message aimed at the healthcare industry, a message meant to spark conversation, outrage, attention. But here's the unsettling part. If that was the goal, then the method chosen to deliver that message was murder. Planned, executed, and carried out in public, which raises a question that sits at the center of this entire case. At what point does belief turn into justification for violence? Because according to investigators, Mangione didn't act impulsively. He didn't snap. He didn't lose control. He allegedly spent months preparing, studying, waiting, until the moment was perfect. And when it came, he followed through, exactly as planned. Back in New York, the investigation intensified. Surveillance footage, witness statements, digital trails. Every piece of evidence began to form a picture. A man on a bike, a suspect moving through the city, a timeline that slowly closed in. And then, 5 days later, that picture found its subject, sitting quietly, miles away, as if nothing had happened. But everything had. And now, with Mangione in custody, the case was only just beginning. Because arresting a suspect is one thing. Proving what happened, understanding why it happened, and uncovering everything that led to that moment on a Manhattan street. That's where the real story begins. And what investigators would soon uncover would make this case even more disturbing than anyone first imagined. Because sometimes, the most dangerous part of a crime is not the act itself, but the thinking behind it. And in this case, that thinking may have been the plan all along. If you've made it this far, you already know this story is different. But trust me, what comes next will change the way you see this case completely. Make sure you like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what happens next. Because the deeper we go, the darker the story becomes. And I want to know, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. By the time Luigi Mangione was placed in custody, investigators believed they had stopped a man who didn't just commit a crime, but someone who had been building toward it for a long time. Because once the arrest was made, the focus shifted immediately. From who did it, to how far this really went. And that's when the deeper layers of this case began to unfold. Back in New York, federal agents and NYPD detectives weren't slowing down. They were accelerating. Because now they weren't chasing a suspect anymore. They were reconstructing a mindset, a timeline, a chain of decisions that had started long before November 24, long before the bicycle, long before the gunshots echoed through that Manhattan street. They began pulling everything they could. Digital records, travel history, surveillance footage from multiple locations. And piece by piece, they started to see something that made this case even more unsettling. This wasn't just preparation. It was discipline. Every movement Mangione allegedly made in New York followed a pattern. Controlled. Intentional. Minimal mistakes. Think about that for a moment. A man enters one of the most surveilled cities in the world, stays for over a week, moves between critical locations, tracks a high-profile target, and still manages to disappear after committing murder in broad daylight. That doesn't happen by accident. It suggests something else. Patience, focus, and a willingness to wait until everything aligned perfectly. Investigators believe Mangione didn't rush the attack. He could have acted earlier. He had opportunities, but he didn't take them, because this wasn't about speed. It was about precision. And that raises an even more disturbing question. What was he waiting for? According to authorities, the answer may lie in the timing. Brian Thompson was in New York for a reason. An investor conference. A moment where attention, media, financial, corporate was already building around him. If the allegations are true, then the timing of the attack wasn't random. It was chosen, carefully, deliberately, because what better moment to make a statement than when the world is already watching? And that's where this case takes a darker turn. Because now, investigators weren't just looking at actions. They were looking at intent. Federal officials have suggested that Mangione's alleged motive went beyond the individual victim, that this was about something broader, an attempt to force attention, to create a reaction, to ignite conversation. And if that's true, then this wasn't just an act of violence. It was, in the mind of the suspect, a form of communication. But here's the problem with that. When violence becomes a message, it stops being just a crime. It becomes something much more dangerous, because it opens the door to a mindset where harm is justified by belief. And that's what investigators were trying to understand. What belief? What grievance? What pushed someone from thought to action? As they dug deeper, they focused on everything surrounding Mangione's behavior. Not just in New York, but before. Patterns, statements, anything that could explain why a 26-year-old would allegedly plan something this extreme. But at the same time, another battle was already beginning. Not on the streets, not in the shadows, but in the courtroom. Because as soon as Mangione was taken into federal custody and brought before a judge in Manhattan, his legal defense began to take shape. And it didn't start with arguing guilt or innocence. It started with strategy, critical one, because Mangione wasn't just facing one case. He was facing two, a federal prosecution, and a separate state case brought by the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. Two systems, two sets of prosecutors, two trials, and potentially two different paths to the same outcome. For the defense, this created a serious problem. Because preparing for one murder trial is already one of the most complex legal challenges possible. Preparing for two at the same time, that's something else entirely. And so his lawyers made a move. They asked the court to delay the federal trial, not to avoid it, not to escape it, but to push it back. Their argument was simple, but powerful. You cannot properly defend a man in two major criminal trials at once. They claimed it would overwhelm the defense, limit preparation, and most importantly, threaten Mangione's constitutional right to a fair trial. Because in a case this serious, where the stakes could be life imprisonment, or even death, every detail matters. Every witness, every piece of evidence, every argument, and splitting focus between two courtrooms could mean missing something critical. But from the prosecution's perspective, delays can also be a risk, because time changes things. Memories fade, public attention shifts, narratives evolve. And in a case already this high profile, control of the timeline matters. So now, the case wasn't just about what happened on December 4th. It was about what would happen next. Which trial would go first, how the evidence would be presented, and how a jury, possibly more than one, would interpret everything. And behind all of that was the central issue that continues to divide people who follow this case. Was this a calculated act of targeted violence driven by ideology? Or is there more to the story that hasn't yet been revealed? Because despite everything investigators have alleged, despite the weapon, the timeline, the arrest, there are still gaps, still unanswered questions, still details that haven't been made public. And those gaps, they matter, because in true crime, what we don't know is often just as important as what we do. For example, what exactly did Mangione do during those days in New York? Every hour, every movement, every interaction. Was he completely alone? Or did anyone notice something, anything, that felt off? And what about the planning phase? Months of preparation according to authorities. But what did that actually look like? Was it all internal? Or are there pieces, messages, searches, influences that haven't been fully revealed? Then there's the question of mindset. Because planning something like this requires more than just intention. It requires commitment, sustained over time, without hesitation, without doubt. That's not something that appears overnight. And yet, we're still left trying to understand how it formed. Meanwhile, the public reaction to the case has been intense, divided, emotional. Because when a crime intersects with something as complex as the healthcare industry, people don't just see the act. They see what they believe it represents. Some focus on the victim, a man walking to a meeting killed without warning. Others focus on the alleged motive, a system, frustrations, grievances. But here's the truth that investigators continue to emphasize. No matter the reasoning, no matter the belief, violence doesn't become justified. And that's why this case is being treated with such seriousness. Because if it is proven that this was an attempt to send a message through murder, then the implications go far beyond one victim. It becomes about precedent, about what society allows, about where the line is drawn. And that's why federal charges in this case are so severe. We're talking about use of a firearm to commit murder, interstate stalking resulting in death, use of a suppressor in a violent crime, charges that carry life sentences, even the possibility of the death penalty. This isn't just accountability. This is the full weight of the justice system being applied. And yet, despite all of this, there is still one thing that hasn't happened. The trial. Because until that moment comes, everything remains an allegation. Every detail, every claim, every theory. And that's what makes this phase of the case so critical. Because right now, we are in the space between accusation and proof, between story and verdict. And that space is where everything can change. Because as more evidence comes forward, as arguments are made in court, as jurors eventually sit down and listen, the narrative we think we understand today could look very different tomorrow. And if there's one thing true crime has taught us over and over again, it's this: the deeper you go, the more complicated the truth becomes. So as we move into the final chapter of this story, we're going to step into that courtroom, into the arguments, the evidence, the strategies that could decide everything. Because in the end, this isn't just about what happened on a Manhattan street. It's about what can be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. If you've been following this case closely, then you already know we're only scratching the surface. Make sure you like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because the final part of the story is where everything comes together. And again, I want to hear from you. What do you think about this case so far? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because what happens next might surprise you. By the time this case moves into a courtroom, everything changes. Because up until that point, what we have are allegations. A story built by investigators. A narrative supported by evidence. But in court, that story is challenged, tested, taken apart piece by piece. The courtroom doesn't care about headlines. It doesn't care about public opinion. It cares about proof. And the burden of that proof falls entirely on the prosecution. They have to do more than tell a convincing story. They have to establish, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Mangione planned, executed, and carried out the murder of Brian Thompson exactly as they claim. That means every detail matters. Every second of the timeline. Every movement across New York. Every piece of evidence recovered. Because the defense only needs one thing: doubt. And that's where this case becomes even more intense. Because while the prosecution will build a picture of precision, planning, and intent, the defense will look for cracks, small inconsistencies, unanswered questions, anything that suggests the narrative isn't as complete as it seems. Imagine sitting in that courtroom, hearing about the days leading up to December 4th, the hostile stay under a false identity, the alleged surveillance, the movements through Manhattan, the positioning between two cars, the shots fired, the escape through Central Park, and then the arrest, miles away, with a weapon, a suppressor, an identity that ties everything together. It sounds airtight, but in court nothing is assumed. Everything must be proven. The defense could ask questions like, was the weapon definitively linked to the crime? Are there fingerprints, DNA, ballistics that leave no doubt? Can every movement in New York be traced directly to Mangione without gaps? Is there any possibility of misidentification in surveillance footage? Was he truly alone the entire time? And perhaps the most critical question of all, what was his intent? Because intent is everything in a case like this. It's the difference between degrees of murder, the difference between life and death. Literally. Prosecutors are expected to argue that this was premeditated, planned over months, executed with precision. But proving premeditation isn't just about saying it. It's about showing it, through actions, through patterns, through evidence that demonstrates planning, not impulse. And then there's motive, one of the most complex parts of this case. Authorities have suggested that Mangione's alleged actions were tied to a desire to spark a broader conversation about the healthcare industry. But in court, motive isn't always required to secure a conviction. Still, it shapes how a jury understands the case. Because people want to know why. Why this victim? Why this moment? Why this method? And if the prosecution presents this as an ideological act, the defense may push back hard. They could argue, where is the direct proof of that motive? Are there statements, writings, communications that clearly show this intent? Or is it an interpretation? Because if motive becomes unclear, it introduces something powerful, uncertainty, and uncertainty can influence how jurors see everything else. Meanwhile, outside the courtroom, the world is watching. Cases like this don't exist in isolation. They live in public conversation. They become part of larger debates about violence, about systems, about justice, and that attention can create pressure on prosecutors, on defense attorneys, even on jurors who are instructed to remain impartial but are still human. And then there's the structure of this case itself. 2 prosecutions, state and federal, each with its own strategy, its own timeline, its own approach. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office is expected to move first. That means the state trial could set the tone, establish facts, shape public perception, and potentially influence what happens in federal court later. Because even though they are separate, they are connected, and every decision in one courtroom echoes into the other. Now imagine the weight of that, for the defendant, for the victim's family, for everyone involved. This isn't just one trial. It's a sequence of events that could stretch over months, even years. And with each step, the stakes remain the same. Maximum penalties, life imprisonment, possibly even the death penalty at the federal level. This is the highest level of consequence the justice system can deliver. And yet, for all the complexity, for all the legal strategy, for all the debate, there's one moment that everything builds toward. The verdict. Because in the end, it comes down to a group of jurors. Ordinary people. Listening. Evaluating. Deciding. Did the prosecution prove its case? Beyond a reasonable doubt? Yes or no? That's it. That single decision will define everything that follows. But here's what makes this case linger, even beyond a verdict. Because no matter the outcome, there are questions that may never fully be answered. What was happening inside Mangione's mind during those months of alleged planning? Was there a single moment where everything shifted? Point of no return? Or was this a slow build, a decision formed piece by piece until it became action? And what does it say about a world where someone might believe that violence is the only way to be heard? Those are the questions that don't end in court. They stay. They echo. Because cases like this are not just about crime. They're about understanding the line between thought and action. between belief and justification, between grievance and violence, and how sometimes that line gets crossed on a cold Manhattan morning in less than a few seconds and changes everything for one victim, for one accused, and for everyone watching. Because in the end, this isn't just a story about what happened. It's a story about why it happened and whether that why will ever truly make sense. If you've stayed with this story from the beginning to the end, then you already know this isn't something you forget easily. So if you found this breakdown powerful, make sure you like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more deep true crime stories like this. And I want to hear from you. Do you think this was a calculated message or something deeper we still don't understand? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because conversations like this matter.